We're ready to start. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for making time to join this important discussion so that you may be able to help contribute to what is being the recommendations from the Presidential Climate Commission on the nationally determined contributions that are going to be submitted to the UNFCCC Paris Agreement process. Before we start, I would request that people introduce themselves on the chat and also use the chat for discussions or questions so that those can be noted, as I'm not sure that each and every one of us would have an opportunity to be able to raise their hand, be recognized, and also be able to contribute. So in that way, and I also request that if you're not speaking, please switch off your mic so that we don't have get voices or noise from the other audios, or also not disturb the quality of the audio of the speaker. Thank you very much. We welcome, that was just setting out a little bit of ground rules. The session today, this webinar, is part of the discussions that the Presidential Climate Commission has been hosting on sectoral, on different sectors around the nationally determined contributions. And today's webinar is on the resilience and adaptation, as we know that this is the core. We have experienced runaway climate change, naturally induced disasters. And also we are in an adaptative mode, so to say. But however, there's so much that we can do together, and doing that together would mean that we contribute to shaping and developing what we want to see as our contribution on the nationally determined contributions. And I must say that the process that is taking place is that there is a number of discussions that are taking place around mitigation, around adaptation, and other important issues that are related to the nationally determined contribution. And today's one is on the adaptation and resilience. And I hope that we would be able to contribute as much as we can to the recommendations that the Presidential Climate Change Commission is developing for the DFFE, for the Department of Fisheries, Forestry, and Environment. So I'm going to request that we start with the webinar, and today we're going to have like an update or a dialogue framing and contextualization from Ms. Lebogang Molaisi, who is part of the Presidential Climate Change Secretariat. And then after that, we are going to have a presentation on the draft recommendations that will be done by the Chief Executive Officer of the Presidential Climate Change Commission, Ms. Dora Modise. And then after Dora Modise, we are going to have reflections from social partners. And the reflections from the social partners would cover those from civil society, from business, youth, labor, that are present at this. And then after that, we'll open for more contributions and reflections from the other partners that have joined the webinar today. And then we'll have that discussion, and that we hope that people would also use the chat and not wait for to be able to make verbal contributions to the discussion. And I would like to say that everyone is welcome to use a language of their choice, as long as it's South African spoken language, and whoever would be able to interpret or translate, they would assist us in doing so. So I would like to invite Ms. Lebogang Molaisi for the framing and contextualization of the discussion that we're going to have today. Thank you very much, Lebogang.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for this opportunity to address participants and the public here today. We are in a very exciting period where the PCC is presenting its first draft in terms of the NDC update for the period 2030 to 2035. The PCC has undergone an extensive stakeholder consultation process to inform this draft recommendations report. We began this work late last year with capacity building sessions, and it was then followed up by a round of stakeholder input sessions from various stakeholders. We've tried to be as broad as possible in our efforts to consult with key stakeholders to this particular report. Colleagues will recall that in the actual makeup of the nationally determined contributions is a section related to adaptation, mitigation, as well as the means of implementation. Today, we are consulting thematically, specifically on the chapter related to adaptation. So when the executive director, Ms. Dora Modise, does the presentation, it'll be specifically on adaptation, and the various parties that will be making inputs will be on the section related to adaptation. So basically, this report will be presenting the recommendations specifically on adaptation that will guide the DFFE as it prepares its update on South Africa's nationally determined contributions for the period 2030 to 2035. In our efforts to ground evidence with stakeholder views, the report is grounded in the principles of procedural, distributive, and restorative justice. And the recommendations that you will be seeing today, especially related to adaptation, aim to align South Africa's international commitments with domestic development priorities and legal obligations under the Climate Change Act, and also hopes to address the pressing socio-economic imperatives for our country. Setting an NDC requires dedicated resources, inclusive and whole of society engagement and consultation, better integration across government departments and alignment with sectoral emissions targets, the low emissions development strategies. And having said that, it's important to note that the sets are vital for shaping South Africa's future economy and should be treated as a national priority, with future processes which should be open more to the public. It is important for the updated NDC to reflect South Africa's evolving climate governance landscape. It must take into account the pace and affordability of the transition, considering energy security and sustainable economic growth. One of the things the PCC does accept is that you can transition too quickly, but you can also transition too slowly. Both cases have significant but different economic and social impacts, which we must be cognitive of as we proceed. However, managed correctly, the NDC does present an opportunity to decarbonize existing sectors, gradually phasing out sectors that will cease to be competitive, and also introduce sectors that will create opportunities for employment at scale. The Climate Change Act and the Just Transition Framework for South Africa provide the legal and policy foundation for ensuring that the shift to a low carbon economy is fair, inclusive, supportive of vulnerable communities and workers. Given the escalating climate risks, trade and finance pressures, the domestic inequalities, the 2030 to 2035 NDC update should reflect South Africa's just economic transformation. It must balance local realities with global expectations, clearly outlining policy intentions, and assign responsibility across the various spheres of government. Specifically to adaptation, the scenario-based modeling aligned with the IPCC framework has shown that under high emissions pathways, South Africa would experience warming exceeding 5 degrees nationally by the year 2100, significantly intensifying drought, heat waves, flooding, and coastal storm risks. An intermediate pathway may result in approximately 2.5 to 3 degree warming, while a low emission scenario offers a more manageable transition consistent with 1.5 to well below 2 degrees warming, although residual risks remain under this scenario as well. This presents a critical concern for South Africa as the country is warming at nearly double the global average. These shifts are translating into significant material damage to infrastructure, disruption to basic services, reduced agricultural productivity, and disproportionate harm to the poor and marginalized community. We could face temperature increases of between 2 to 5 degrees across different regions by the end of the century. These rising temperatures will have wide-ranging effects on health, food production, water availability, as well as on infrastructure. So just to say that making a decision about an NDC and whatever range we choose to follow is ultimately a political decision. However, the Climate Change Act introduces a shift that legally binding greenhouse gas emissions trajectory will be gazetted by the minister, with the NDC serving as a transparent communication instrument for domestic and international stakeholders. The existing body of research and evidence shows that a climate-compatible transition is both possible and desirable, but not everything can be modeled. We must pave the way for a just transition towards a low carbon and climate resilient society. And there is ways in which there can be no regret choices that are informed by updating the updated national modeling consistent with a well below 2 degree pathway and remaining mindful of national capacities as well as economic recovery needs. With that, Chair, I'd like to hand back to you. That forms part of the framing for today's discussion. Thank you.
Apologies, you're muted.
Thank you for the context for the discussion today, Lebogang. But before we continue, I would like to request that whoever is responsible for the tech to try mute the people who their mics are on and are not speaking so that we can have a clearer audio. There was particular sections where Lebogang was framing the context of our discussion where we couldn't hear clearly because there was so much background noise from one of the participants that have not muted their mics. So we'd request participants to mute their mics as we go ahead, and the tech people to also assist in that regard. Thank you very much. I will now call on the Chief Executive Officer of the Presidential Climate Change Commission, Ms. Dora Modise, to present on the draft recommendations of the NDCs. Thank you, Ms. Dora Modise. You may go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner Likalakala, for the opportunity, and thank you to Lebogang for the presentation. Maybe let me apologize in advance and also for Lebogang because I know she is at the Green Hydrogen Summit, so that background might have been coming from the fact that she's not in a controlled space. I'm also not in a controlled space at the moment. I'm in Tshwane at the U20 summit, tried to find a quiet spot, but just to apologize just in case I get disturbed a bit during the presentation. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible without compromising the key issues arising from the recommendations. So in this presentation, we'll just do a quick overview, especially if there are participants in this meeting that wouldn't have engaged with this content before. So I'll spend some time on just a perspective and why the agency on adaptation, and then get into the recommendations that are in the current draft report. Okay, so the NDCs, as we would all recall, that they are all stemming from the Paris Agreement, wherein countries are supposed to, every 5 years, present updated nationally determined contributions that would really demonstrate how we aim to comply with the Paris targets. They're mainly looking at the 1.5 degree, staying below the 1.5 degree temperature increase. So that's for us the north, the key issue that we're looking toward. But then at the same time, as we do and we commit to particular targets over the years that ensure that we comply with the Paris Agreement, we need to ensure that we reduce emissions and build resilience, which is one of the key critical issues. And very often we focus a lot on the emissions reductions part of the NDC, even both in documentary purposes, but then also in the actions that we undertake. So NDCs are meant to show us how the country plans to reduce emissions, and also showing commitment on how we will remain resilient and adapt to the impacts of climate change. The third key component of the NDC for us is, over and above the emissions reductions, is the adaptation part of the NDCs, which for me lays the foundation of why is it that we are committing to a certain emissions reductions range. We need to understand how we adapt to and remain resilient to the impacts that are already happening. And this is the component that this meeting is supposed to be focusing on, the adaptation component of the NDC. There's also a key issue around NDC planning. Every 5 years, like I've said, we submit. So in 2025, which is this year, the updated NDC needs to be submitted. As per Lebohang's presentation at the beginning, our role as the Presidential Commission at this point is to have key recommendations that go into South Africa's NDC as the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment prepare to submit that NDC by September. The key issue that we've anchored the work that we've been doing on is the fact that NDCs must be ambitious. But ambitious not in a blind way. They must remain ambitious, but at the same time taking into consideration in-country circumstances and special considerations. So we've really taken time to look into that, and I would like to encourage us as we give inputs into the draft report that we also look at that. And the reason why we are holding these sessions is the fact that we are not naive to the reality that says we don't know everything, and we rely on multiple stakeholders like yourselves to inform what we put forward. Those that have been following the UNFCCC process, you would know that the Article 7 of the Paris Agreement is very clear on what we must put into our NDC. So mitigation, increased mitigation efforts. Secondly, adaptation that responds to development and contributes to the country's development. Thirdly, the issue of inclusivity, ensuring that our climate actions are country-driven, gender-responsive, respect traditional language, knowledge, but then also ensure that adaptation efforts will differ based on context. Then the issue of support, international support to developing countries. But what we are seeing coming up more and more is also the South-South collaboration and how we ensure financial flows between South-South nations whilst holding the Global North responsible for their contribution from a financial support perspective. Then the issue of integrating adaptation into development planning and national strategies. You would have noted in South Africa, a lot of work has been happening around integrating not just adaptation, honestly, even the decarbonization agenda into national strategies. And as the PCC, we've been really doing our best to track that. So that remains central to this. And then most importantly, is the use of monitoring, evaluation, and learnings to try and improve adaptation actions that we put in place. Over and above the provisions of Article 7 in the Paris Agreement is the UAE Framework for Climate Resilience that was adopted at COP28 in Dubai. And this, the UAE framework guides the achievement of the global goal on adaptation. And I think this was the first key milestone that got us to really move towards having clear goals on adaptation. Goals on mitigation have been quite clear from the onset. And it outlines a number of key actions that must be undertaken. We've just selected a few that we feel are critical at this point. So firstly, issue of sectoral and thematic targets for key systems like your water security, food, public health, infrastructure, as well as ecosystems. So, and the UAE framework is very clear that these key thematic targets and actions must be reflected in NDCs. So this next iteration of the NDCs would be the first after the UAE framework was adopted. So very critical that we ensure that those targets of these key systems in adaptation are incorporated. The second issue is to have forward-looking matrices that would track the outcomes and resilience building over time, rather than just listing adaptation activities. We've been grappling with the issue of really tracking adaptation action and the impact that such programs have on the ground. As you would all agree, adaptation is very difficult to measure because very often adaptation and resilience programs are developmental in nature, unlike your emissions reductions program. So it even takes time to be able to track real impact on the ground, but that is not impossible to do. So we would be looking towards that integration. And also systems integration, excuse the slight typo on that bullet, but integration of equity, inclusivity, and social justice remains a key issue. So why is it urgent? Why is adaptation urgent at this point in time? We've looked at a series of modeling and a scenario-based modeling that's aligned with the IPCC's SSP RCP framework shows that under the current pathway, if we really don't move as prompt as we need to, South Africa could experience warming that exceeds 5 degrees Celsius by 2100. And that would significantly intensify the impacts that we're currently having, especially on extreme weather conditions. We have seen even in this week alone, the flooding incidents that we've been experiencing in the Eastern Cape, the loss of life, infrastructure, and livelihoods that are being experienced. So we would then see increased severity and frequency of such occurrences. Secondly, if an immediate pathway, mitigation pathway is undertaken, this might result in approximately 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius warming. That is still quite severe when you look at it, because with the current, it is understood that the current pathway would take us to 5 degrees, but then we've got some mitigation options in place, which are not enough. They are taking us off of the mark towards a 3 degrees Celsius warming. The target is to go below 1.5 degrees, and a low emission scenario that we are coming with will bring us to a manageable trajectory of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. And ideally, we should probably aim to get towards that. We are very cautious in even talking about these figures because that means a significant restructuring of the economy for us to even get to that low emissions scenario situation. And there would be some residual risks that come up even if we go as ambitious as we can as a country, and therefore the actions that we undertake in remaining resilient becomes a key priority. When we look at priority systems for resilience building, there are a number of systems that one can look at. But as a start for us, I mean, the first three talk to the food, water, and energy nexus, which is quite key in terms of anchoring the economy. So water security, agriculture and food security, as well as energy resilience and access. And here, not even talking about the emissions reductions part of energy, but just ensuring universal access remains a key issue. Human health and social protection, integrated nature-based solutions, as well as the built environment and spatial planning that also includes transport, and that's where the role of local government would come in very strongly. Just then, the last slide before I go into the recommendations. A review of the 2021 adaptation section of the NDC tells us a number of issues. So what we know is that in the 2021 updated NDC, we outlined 5 adaptation goals. That was a need to reduce vulnerability, integration of adaptation into planning, the strengthening institutional capacity, especially at the local government level, improved information and early warning system, as well as resource mobilization to accelerate climate action. A review was done, the first biennial transparency report that was submitted in 2024 that reviewed how we were erring with regard to our 2021 commitments, has identified a number of key challenges. The first issue is the finance shortfalls, and I'll talk to that also when I get into the recommendations. There has been some finance flows in climate action, but flows towards adaptation leave a lot of room for improvement. Implementation barriers also remain, and central to that is the issue of capacity to implement, but then also capacity to successfully design bankable climate resilience and adaptation projects, and especially those that are focusing on key development matrices or key priority sectors. We've also seen limited social inclusion, so there has been areas where local communities are really left out, but then also the space is still not yet fully understood by all key social partners, but then even the men on the street. So that has been seen as a key challenge. And then also no real framework to quantify or systemically address loss and damage. So we know that with any, and I think flooding incidents, extreme precipitation and flooding are the most visible impacts, and where you can see there is loss and there's damage to infrastructure, but it's not fully computed, and there's no way of quantifying the amount of loss. And in most instances, there's livelihoods and families are lost. So loss of life remains a very difficult index to calculate in monetary terms. But then also there are other losses in the climate impact space, like heat stroke, impact on work productivity and all of that. So it's been very difficult to quantify. Now, let me go through a series of recommendations that we have in the draft report. They are categorized into 6 key areas. The first one being priority systems for resilience that we would like to look at. And that includes all of those systems that I've mentioned initially. So no real change there on the systems that we would like to look at. So actions, and remember what we said in terms of what's in the UAE framework is that there must be tangible targets and action-based targets aligned to these key systems or priority systems for resilience. So our first key recommendation is that this South Africa's NDC that goes in towards the end of this year must clearly articulate key actions under each of these areas. Secondly is the issue of transformative justice, transformative and justice-based adaptation. So the issue of inclusivity, so promoting inclusive and justice-centered solutions through planning and implementation. Secondly is that systemic drivers must be addressed and especially on issues on spatial inequality issues, weak infrastructure and marginalization. So where do you start when you are addressing those systemic drivers that we've mentioned on the first spot? So be it water security, spatial planning, transport infrastructure and all that, you start with the most vulnerable. And you look at spatial representation of those actions that need to be undertaken. And you look at where systems have been weakened over time rather than being improved. So systems prioritization through the lens of transformative justice remains a key issue. So as we put those targets in place, this must be integrated, so not a separate section that says, well, we are going to ensure that there is justice for all. That is just a statement, but we need to see it in the actions that come forward. The third out of the 6 would be policy and regulatory strengthening. So we are quite excited that the Climate Change Act has been promulgated for implementation. So therefore, accelerated implementation remains a key priority to ensure that we have a coordinated climate response. The Act is not perfect, but it is the best that we can have at this point in time. And we then feel like, especially issues around sectoral targets and carbon budgets remain key priority in terms of implementing the Act. And then secondly, ensuring timely establishment of supporting regulations and institutional structures. So the Act gives way for establishment of a number of structures, establishment of certain regulations that are supposed to guide implementation. And from an adaptation perspective, especially at different levels of government, but then a local government, I mean, I'm an avid supporter of local government. So therefore, those systems must be prioritized to allow or pave the way for accelerated implementation. The fourth key recommendation is the elevating of adaptation ambition capacity. So we are recommending the adoption of an anticipate, adapt, and recover framework to guide adaptation planning through all levels of government, but then also economic sectors. So it's not just for government to implement. And then also aligning adaptation with climate resilient development paradigm and integration of the theory of change for effective monitoring and evaluation. And as you know, what you can't measure will not be done, and we will not be able to know the impact. So strengthening the monitoring systems remain a central priority. The fifth key recommendation is scaling the integration of adaptation finance. So there is a major adaptation finance gap. So far, we've only seen flows of about $7.6 million US. That's against a target of 3 to 4 billion by 2030. As they are supposed to. There are systems that can be implemented to ensure that these funds flow at a much faster rate. We feel that the international systems establish a fund and come up with framework at a global level. That's been done for many years and has yielded very slow movements, and which is why we are now advocating for country-led platforms like your country platforms that allows for nationally determined and nationally led and implemented finance systems that can still be sourced or supported by international finances. And we are also looking at multiple sources of funds rather than just bilateral and philanthropic funds. Embedded adaptation finance in national budgets and access to international funds remains a key issue. I mean, the loss and damage fund was established, like I've mentioned. So systems to try and easily access it remains a key priority. But then climate budgeting as well. National Treasury is busy with climate tagging work, and that's the work that we would like to closely follow to make sure that our national budgets are truly aligned to climate resilience and adaptation. The last set of recommendations focus on national loss and damage response framework. As you can recall, the 2024 review was very clear that there is no proper framework that talks to loss and damage. So we currently have a disaster management center and a disaster management strategy and some risk reduction principles. So yes, aligned to that, let's effectively compute and calculate loss and damage and link loss and damage responses to clear finance sources and a clear strategy at a national level to ensure implementation. So that was the sixth recommendation, Chairperson. I believe I tried my best to summarize, hoping that participants would have gone through the report. So open to discussion at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistora, particularly on the recommendations. I think that's what we'll get respondents responding on, or maybe any other issue that after reading the recommendation or the NDC's recommendations as shared. And then on the respondents, I have Hello, Mkumbeni, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. I have Brandon Abino and I have Buitumelo Mulete. So I would start with Hello Mkumbeni, who is would be making reflections from a youth perspective. Hello, you are welcome. And then after that, I'll have Buitumelo and end up with Brandon Abino. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity and the inclusiveness of this process to really reflect on how the recommendations have been. I think that a lot of the recommendations offer a strong vision and a systemic approach to adaptation, especially in its view of critical areas such as water, food, infrastructure, coastal systems. And I think even among the youth constituent, we see this as very key for building resilience. The updated NDCs for South Africa have to be ambitious, but even more importantly, sector defined with targets. And in doing so, we have to be very cognizant of feasibility. How feasible are these targets, especially because they are largely dependent on how do we unlock finance, how do we build institutional capacity, especially at the municipal level, because it is local municipalities who are at the front line of adaptation, and we have to ensure that they are equipped to deliver. And without this kind of support and dependencies, this NDC will likely just remain good on paper. So it has to be that our NDCs are whole of society approach. So again, coordination is key, not just at local level, at national level, but local, provincial, and municipal levels. And I particularly resonate with the AAR framework because it offers an approach that will allow us to anticipate potential hazards that may be coming, especially in vulnerable regions, but also to adapt and recover. It's a more strategic approach that we really need when it comes to adaptation. Pertaining key issues that have been outlined in the recommendations. Firstly, when it comes to adaptation finance shortfalls, I mean, as we know, this is something that has been very prominent. We are experiencing shortfalls with South Africa receiving very limited international climate funding, just 860 million USD between 2021 and 2022. It's not enough because South Africa actually needs 3 to 4 billion by 2030 to meet its adaptation specific funding. So I think there is definitely a need to scale up adaptation finance, and that requires a very intentional and strategic investment plan and a finance mobilization strategy that will enable us to really have the capacity to implement our NDCs, but other adaptation related policies as well. The second is institutional barriers. So as we know, there are a lot of capacity constraints that are prevalent at municipal and provincial levels when it comes to adaptation. And we have to ensure that we resource local governments in particular, technically, and to ensure that they have the means to implement, and to ensure that there are dedicated finance channels as well to ensure municipalities to actually secure funding and to implement adaptation. The other key issue that has been identified in the recommendations is limited social inclusion. So, I mean, as we know, a lot of our strategies, even from the Climate Act, they acknowledge the importance of local knowledge and gender responsive approaches, but these are actually not systemically embedded within our adaptation planning and implementation at scale. And this is also limited in how we understand the role of young people in policy. So I think that even in our last NDCs, youth was only mentioned once, and it was in reference to young people participating in the consultations, which is not adequate. The lack of representation of children and youth in NDCs can hinder how we systemically engage on adaptation, but also how we address specific needs that young people may have. And I mean, even around the world, less than half of the current NDCs are considered not child sensitive, which is a key issue that we really need to tackle, especially in how we implement the NDCs. And we need to do so in a way that pays very specific attention to the risks and the vulnerabilities that these vulnerable groups may be under. The other key issues that in terms of the systems that relate to adaptation, we have to build resilience, particularly in water and urban systems. As we've seen, there is a lot of vulnerability there. So we have to ensure that we then it requires ecosystem-based management, integrated planning, and improved governance, which is a key issue that will likely hinder and determine how effective our NDC implementation goes. And this requires quite rigorous climate risk assessment. So how do we assess so that we can inform land use, housing, infrastructure development, especially in coastal and urban areas? So another key issue is sustainable and spatial planning. So we need to also think about how that can prioritize solutions that will enable communities to adapt and be resilient in the face of climate changes, but also consider public mobility and equitable design of urban and rural areas as well, so that we withstand the impacts that may come from climate change. Another issue that seems to be overlooked in NDCs is the ocean climate nexus. As we may know, oceans are very key to how we respond to climate. They regulate our rainfall, our carbon storage. They support fisheries and tourism, yet they very much seem to be underrepresented, not just in NDCs, but in other strategies as well. So we have to really think about that as well. I mean, about 22% of South Africans live within 20 kilometers of the coast, and this is mainly concentrated with major metropolitan areas. So we really should be considering how these communities are threatened by sea level rise and other issues that may be coming, like frequent storms and flooding. And we should be considering the coast and how do we protect marine biodiversity and the ecosystems that they live very close to, so that we buffer climate impacts, but also secure the livelihoods of people and ensure climate stability. And to finally close, I think that when it comes to adaptation, the most pertinent thing that we ought to be aware of is that we need to have a systemic shift in how we think about adaptation, but how we deal with it, right? Adaptation has been framed as a problem so many times in how we engage with it in policy practice, but also in general in society. And we need to think of it as more of an opportunity. Yes, it is a pressing issue, but it is one that we can resolve with the right investment, the right governance, and inclusive engagement. And I think this is a moment for us to redefine how we view adaptation as a pathway for transformation to reduce climate risk, so that we can have co-benefits for people, but also for the environment. And I think that we need to view adaptation as a pathway that can create jobs, reduce inequality, but ensure just and resilient systems. And in addition, in our NDCs, we should be reflecting on impact areas where vulnerable groups are placed, especially children and women and youth. So looking at areas such as education, where are young people impacted when it comes to hazards on adaptation, health, infrastructure, etc. But also we should be equipping women, youth, people with disabilities with skills and assets to participate in economies, adaptation economies, if you will, focusing on pathways the way adaptation can be linked to employment. We are a country where unemployment is very rife, and I think when it comes to adaptation, there is an opportunity for us to view adaptation as a strategic area to support job creation and livelihood, especially in the green and blue economies. So it should not only address the issue around climate change. Adaptation should be a measure for us to approach vulnerabilities such as inequalities, weak infrastructure, marginalization. And I think even in the recommendations, they make reference to distributive, restorative, and procedural justice principles that should underpin our NDCs. And this is something that should be considered as well. But also it should be considered in also protecting young people, women, and youth as both vulnerable groups, but active stakeholders, ensuring that their rights are also ensuring their rights in meaningful participation and in decision making. And in addition, another key aspect of this is that we have to ensure that we enhance inclusive insurance and financial security nets, particularly in protecting smallholder workers in climate vulnerable sectors like informal trade, tourism, and farming. So this will really require redesigning accessible insurance and finance support mechanisms so that we tailor for the needs of those who are vulnerable. And it requires us being intentional about actually bringing private sector to the table, ensuring that the government and authorities collaborate in co-creating how these systems work and ensure that they also are involving communities and align with the realities of those on the ground. So essentially, this NDC update shouldn't just be a technical process that starts at the top and stays there. It should not just be a technical requirement that we are sending to the Conference of the Parties and it ends there. It has to be a moment for us to realign our ambitions, but also to reflect our lived realities, particularly as a country that comes from a history of inequality and a current status quo of inequality. It has to reflect that, and it has to reflect redress in that and build resilience to ensure a just future. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kgaugelo. That was the views from the youth. Now I'm just very happy that some of the points that you brought up, or maybe some of the points that would be included into some of the recommendations that are going to be taken to the DFFE. But I think the issues that you brought up, the human face of adaptation, is quite important. And this is what we really want to see this NDCs looking at. I would like to remind the audience that please use the chat for either your questions, your comments, as we continue with the views from the other social sectors. And now I would call on Boitumelo Molete from Labour, or giving us the Labour perspectives on the NDCs, and maybe also commenting on the recommendations that have been shared with all of us, particularly from the presentation that Usistora did this morning, earlier on. Thank you very much. Boitumelo, you may go ahead.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Lekalakala. Thanks to the Secretariat for a very comprehensive presentation, from the setting of the scene to the actual recommendations that the ED has presented. I think they are very well captured. I think we're not here to just debate whether or not adaptation is necessary. We're here to insist that adaptation must be just, it must be inclusive, and also it must be worker-centered. As Lebogang has noted in her introductory comments, I mean, South Africa is warming at nearly twice the global average, and we're facing the adversities as the country. We're recently seeing the Eastern Cape floods that have left people to destitute. We've been struggling with heat waves, water shortages, as well as other disease outbreaks. And this just does not present an environmental threat. It is a threat to human lives. It's a threat to workers in the workplace, their livelihoods, and also to the public at large. As organized labor, I think it's important that we note that adaptation is a priority of ours, and that we would want to see an adaptation pillar of the NDC, which prioritizes the poor, which prioritizes the working class, and also is able to address structural inequalities. We also believe that the principle of decent work creation is important to also assist in building resilience. When organized labor speaks about just transition, and usually people are not accustomed to knowing that the just transition concept actually comes from workers. The hijacking of the just transition context, at some point, we're seeing other issues being elevated beyond what they should, leaving others behind. While we understand mitigation is important, and we speak about energy transitions, the coal phase outs, and all of the shifts that are speaking to the industrial side of the transition, we're not really focusing on the part of adaptation towards a just transition. And this is going to be very important when we present an NDC that is sensitive to issues of adaptation. We'd want to see the protection of jobs as well as income. The ED speaks very clearly, and I think Lebogang in all of her articulation speaks about the importance of sectoral targets in the NDC, and as organized labor, we firmly support that and believe that it's going to be important for us to make sure that these sectoral targets are able to articulate what the sector requires and able to measure how it is that the sector can actually transition and be adaptive. We also believe that we need to focus on expanding the employment programs that exist to be able to absorb adaptation-related work. The issue of reskilling and upskilling of workers for adaptation is important, and this is rightly placed in local government as we envision as organized labor. The issues of health, housing, and water is very important. And when the ED speaks about those key priorities that were presented historically, I think we want to emphasize how we need to build up on that, ensuring that we're focusing on water security, food security, special planning, social protection, and etc. That is very important to ensure that we are building sufficient resilience. We also believe that local government is a part that needs to be further invested in terms of how we envision adaptation measures to actually be implementable, so that there's sufficient budgeting that is filtered through to the local government. This also includes ensuring that workers in local government are incorporated into these plans so that they also are part of a responsive adaptation measure. We are also very clear in what the Paris Agreement stipulates and means in terms of the global North supporting the global South to transition. While we caution on the loans versus grants ratio and we caution on further indebting the country, we believe that we can work through a developmental approach when it comes to the modeling of climate finance to ensure that financing and funding is being channeled to the people, it's been channeled to working class people, and that we are building sufficient safety nets for these communities and workers to be able to also form part of a low carbon and climate resilient economy. So we need to prioritize ensuring that issues of loss and damage are really sufficiently covered. Outside of the UNFCCC speaking about the loss and damage fund to our engagement as organized labor, we have not seen how it is that the loss and damage fund is going to be able to absorb and assist global South communities and workers to be able to transition adequately and efficiently. Chair, I think just to indicate that we're well in support of the PCC's draft recommendations. However, even in our prior engagements and the capacity building workshop that we had a huge concern about the role of the DFFE in how we are able to channel these draft recommendations and how these will be processed. Our concern currently is also the lack of integration within government in relation to putting forward the NDCs for the UNFCCC, but also how it is that we're going to have these PCC recommendation incorporated and well within the submission of COP30. So Chair, that would be ours from organized labor. We are very happy to see adaptation being risen to a point that we are actually speaking about it as a key part of ensuring that the NDC is inclusive and ensures that workers, people that are vulnerable would be considered. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Lebogang. Those were the views, Bitumelo. Those were the views from labor perspective, and I hope that some of the questions that you posed are noted, and we might get a response here, or we might get a response with further engagements on the proposed or the recommendations on the nationally determined contributions, or if there's anyone from DFFE who would like to make a contribution who's part of the audience can actually maybe also directly respond to you. Now I'm going to invite Brandon Abdinho to give us the civil society perspectives. Thank you, Brandon. You may go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to everybody. It's good to be here and good to be having these discussions. So these reflections are from civil society, and they're certainly not from all of civil society, but as we do, we've put our heads together, the various role players in the social and climate justice space, and came up with some reflections. So they relate to the PCC recommendation, but also to NDCs and what NDCs require, in our opinion, as a whole, as well as some of the underlying adaptation considerations. We make these or share these reflections acknowledging that the NDC is a high-level document, and as Lebogang said, it's a political intervention, and as such is very important in terms of signaling intention to the outside world, which has implications for climate finance, among other things, but also signals internally. So in other words, what can we active in the space expect and hold the state to? As such, we know that NDCs don't have that high level of granularity that we would see, for example, in a national adaptation plan. But nonetheless, we think that the wording of the NDC is important and that it can, even though the wording is relatively minimal, it can put into place interventions which address some of the concerns and considerations that I'm going to speak about. Also, work put in at this NDC level can help down the line when we engage with national adaptation plans and mechanisms like that, for example. Much has happened since the last NDC in the adaptation space. We've had the global stocktake, we've had the NDC synthesis report. We know that the global goal of adaptation is developing, and we now have the UAE framework mentioned by other speakers. We also understand the science a lot more. There have been many strides made in attribution. We can now tell with a greater degree of certainty which climate change impacts have caused which impacts on the ground, and lived experiences in this country, often floods, droughts, wildfires, and the like. And these also have knock-on or indirect effects. One of the areas that is of concern is the lack of urgency. Certainly in the last NDC or the 2021 update, it is raised to a degree in the PCC's recommendation, but we feel it could be stronger in there. And this concern is informed by the seeming lack of urgency at a foundational level. We know that the Climate Change Act sets out an entire framework for adaptation, but those mechanisms have not been operationalized yet, which means that a whole lot of follow-on steps such as objective scenarios, national plans, sector plans, and provincial and municipal implementation plans do not have the clock ticking. In some cases, like a municipal plan would need to be in place 5 years after the act is operationalized, so that makes it 2030, and we know we don't have that sort of time to not be gearing ourselves up to do the necessary adaptation. There's also concern about the lack of capacity to engage, so that's across organs of state, but many other role players within the society as well. We feel that the NDC should speak to enhanced mainstreaming, understanding, and political will. The ED mentioned the National Treasury tagging system, and we know from Treasury that one of the challenges to rolling that out is that people within the line functions just don't understand climate change sufficiently to know whether expenditure is climate change related, for example. We're working on behalf of some clients with one of the major metros in the country, and they're trying to release an integrated development plan, which has hardly any mention of climate change in it. And policy documents like that should be mainstreaming climate change. So we'd like to see the IDC highlight the need for enhanced mainstreaming. Very importantly, as a number of other speakers have said as well, is to foreground social justice in adaptation measures, and very much ensuring bottom-up participation so that all voices can be heard and local and indigenous knowledge informs measures. The danger of it being top-down only is that people on the ground understand what their needs are, what it is that they're losing with the impacts, what they would need to be protected. And so those voices need to be in the mix so that it's a combination, if you like, of top-down and bottom-up. We've heard mentioned that the UAE framework speaks of equity, inclusivity, and justice. And our Just Transition framework gives us guidance on what that looks like. So again, as Khogelo said, use the opportunity for this to be transformative and justice-based. We can make the world a better place through sound climate change adaptation. It's great in the draft recommendation to see the thematic and sectoral areas. I think these give us important focal points to work with. Sometimes we speak in generalities. So when we start speaking food system, water, health, etc., infrastructure, in a sense, it's often easier to start pulling together the planning and interventions needed. We need to know what these things cost. Means of implementation is obviously a huge factor, and we know that there's a massive underinvestment in adaptation generally in the climate finance arena. So understanding what those costs are, and we need to keep pushing at the global level for that finance. But we also know that it's slow in coming, and perhaps some of it will never come. So what can we do with our existing budgets to start advancing the agenda? It's important to highlight that while impacts are local, the overall effect is global, and this will have an impact on loss and damage. The better we adapt, the more we can limit loss and damage, and vice versa. Very important to help build social capacity to engage, really democratize the process, make the concept as simple as possible, and have meaningful, targeted, people's-led participation processes where, you know, it's not a case of helicoptering in, telling people what's going to happen, but really have a back and forth conversation so that the information and knowledge can feed in from all sides. Important to expand the foregrounding of gender and youth. And then to link priority sectors to global goal and adaptation targets and the UAE framework. We need to highlight sustainable or climate-proof infrastructure development. It's good to see nature-based solutions there. We know that sound nature-based solutions can play a big role in adaptation. We can look at eThekwini as a role model in some of the work that's been done there. But we need to have the guardrails in place. Nature-based solutions is one of those places that can justify dodgy carbon market transactions or greenwashing. So we need to make sure that sound guardrails are in there for that, and around maladaptation as well, to make sure that the measures we do put in place don't have unintended consequences. We need to highlight the linkages to job creation, economic development, climate-friendly industrialization, and climate jobs. Again, this is an opportunity to make the world better for everybody and to facilitate a deep, just transition. Thank you, Chair. I think I will leave it there.
Thank you very much. The three speakers, they spoke to the transformative and gender-based and justice-based adaptation as outlined by the recommendations that have been shared with us. And one of the issues that they also raised is around inclusivity. And this is exactly what is happening. The Presidential Climate Change Commission continuously is inviting members of society to be part of these conversations, of these discussions and dialogues. And I really like that this is a continuous issue that comes up, but the Presidential Climate Commission, and that's why we have this webinar, so that we can all be part of discussions of shaping how do we want the future to be like. I'm now going to open the floor, but before I do that, we do have commissioners on the call, and I would like them to also make contributions. I know Commissioner Janserobi is on the call, and I would invite you to maybe make a contribution, and particularly that you've been part of the working group on adaptation, and you also have hosted this kind of discussions. The floor is yours, Commissioner Janserobi.
Good afternoon, Chair, and good afternoon, participants. And apologies for not making myself available for a camera shot. I'm simply not in a position to do so, and I'll explain that during tomorrow's meeting. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for being able to make a contribution to today's discussion. I represent the agricultural sector, and I think it goes without saying that the agricultural sector is probably the most vulnerable when it comes to the anticipated consequences of climate change is going to entail and what it actually entails already. the agricultural sector faces changes to the climate that affect the livelihoods of farmers, all of them, large scale, small scale, emerging farmers, all of us, on a daily basis. We've gone through a sectoral study and a sectoral report being produced by the Presidential Climate Commission about the impacts of climate change on the agricultural and food systems sectors in South Africa altogether. And it's heartening to see the balanced view, I think, with respect to the fact that climate change affects all of us. The adaptation strategies that have been proposed in the sectoral report are equally balanced, and I think heartening in that respect too, and it differentiates obviously between the differences in our society, which is starkly visible within the agricultural sector, within a large-scale commercial sector, and then also the small-scale and emerging sectors, both equally and vitally important to food security or food and nutrition security in South Africa altogether. I think the NDC, it is an odd thing, obviously, working with nationally determined contributions to see adaptation measures being included in there, because NDCs normally refer to mitigation as such, but there's been a consistent and progressive change in thinking about the necessity for adaptation measures to be included in reports with respect to determining nationally determined contributions. I think, and Chair, I did not prepare particular drafting notes on with respect to submissions today, but I think at the risk of sounding, no, I never sound controversial, but I do want to say this. What we're saying has been said many times before. It's not new what we're saying with respect to adaptation within the sectors that are affected. What we need is implementation, fast implementation. We don't have the time to go through and rehash plans that have been submitted and have been on the table for a very long time. We also have to face the realities, I think, about what the agricultural sector and our food system sector in particular face on a daily basis. Almost no government support, and I don't see that that's going to be changing for the agricultural sector in particular. And those statistics can be verified. We're one of the countries that receives almost no government funding, and yet is able to feed our population through a well-established commercial sector, but also a vitally important small-scale emerging sector that does not have the access to finance, does not have the market accessibility that commercial or traditional food systems actually have. So my plea in connection with the adaptation part of the NDC framework and report is it's all good. These plans are sound, they're well-defined, they're well-crafted over time, but we need very good, effective implementation of these plans on a rapid scale. We also have to look at ourselves. Nobody's going to invest in South Africa and invest in climate funding or provide climate-related funding for adaptation and all the requirements that are needed with respect to adaptation measures as proposed in the report. We need to make sure that South Africa is also that kind of country where people want to invest in, and particularly want to invest in an agricultural sector that is viable and sustainable and has this crucial role that it needs to play, not only for our own country, but for sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. And we need to get our act in order with respect to policies and procedures and governance with respect to how we respond to climate change, and also how we prepare and position ourselves with those capital flows that are required to be invested in South Africa to make ourselves much more resilient and also play our rightful part in the whole debate about climate change and how to mitigate the effects on that. Lastly, Chair, I'm sure you'll get to it. We live in a changed world. The largest emitter and the largest economy in South Africa is simply paying no regard to United Nations obligations in terms of the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement altogether. And it's not for me to say what the politicians should be saying about that when we go to Belém later this year to negotiate, what our commitments are in terms of international treaties on this. But it's a shocking indictment for all of us, I suppose, to be able to see this happening in our own time from a government that is really making the efforts that we get to put to shame. Maybe that's out of line for a commissioner to say, but I think it's worth mentioning that as well. We have to take a cognizance of the fact we lived in a radically changed political dispensation altogether. Chair, maybe I should stop now. I might be getting in trouble with these statements, but But from my point of view, those were the contributions that I'd like to make.
Thank you, Commissioner Yanserobi. You're not getting into trouble. I think these are the kinds of views that we'd like to hear, and also that you just shared with us one important component of what needs to be put on the NDCs. As you know, that part of the priorities on this NDCs, it's around agriculture and built environment and water security. So your comments or your contribution, I think it's apt. And the other thing is that I like what you said, you know, that we might have a beautiful written document, and that is going to be presented and we get praises all over, but implementation is what is important. And do we have the means of implementation? Also, what was raised by the youth views is around financing, and that was also raised by labor and also raised by civil society. We might have beautiful plans. We know that we have adaptation policies, and there's so much that it's happening around that. And we know that finance is one of the issues. It's one of the pressing issues that we don't have finance. And from the Presidential Climate Commission, there's that process of the Just Adaptation, Resilience, Investment Plan process also going, trying to raise funds for resilience. But just to leave it there, I'd like to invite the participants for their contributions, their comments, and their questions. And also, please put your comments, your questions, or your contributions also on the chat. They are noted, and if you have put your question on the Q&A, that will also be responded to. If not responded to during the webinar, there will be a follow-up, and that would be responded to. I can't see hands here, and I would like to request Ntabiseng to help me with recognizing the hands, if there are any. Then there's also comments that have been put on the chat here. I would also like someone also to help me to read through, or just pick 2 or 3 of them, just to read to everyone, those who don't have an access to a Q&A chat. Thank you. Ntabiseng, are there any hands?
There's a hand from Lita. She already has spoken.
Lita, you are welcome.
Hi, can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Thank you. So I am from Gauteng. I sit in the Gauteng's Premier's Expert Advisory Committee on Climate Change, which works quite closely with the presidential one. I just wanted to share some of the things that could perhaps assist us as we prepare for the inputs into the NDC later in the year. But, you know, I think it's high time that we speak or secure the attention of municipalities and metros. And I'm saying this because at some point in the last 2 years, we were at the City of New York, and the City of New York has a contingency plan for climate change adaptation, and it is not a complicated one. It is just a plan that has some strategies and some actions to prepare and respond to and recover from climate-related hazards and protecting residents and infrastructure. And it's got risk, it's got impact assessment, etc., etc. And there are response strategies and who's involved. And for me, this is like a 2-pager. It's a 2-pager and aligns the budget even the finance component or the budget itself is half a page. You know, it's a spreadsheet that says this is what the city is going to do. Now, for me, I understand the importance of our national response in the nationally determined contributions, but also how do we, as a commission, how do we prevent what has just happened in UMTAD? And for me, it's not difficult. It's about calling local government, calling SALGA, and assisting them in doing contingency plans for the cities in the country, for the municipalities in the country, for the districts in the country. And so for me, as we make this overall input as a country, it is informed by the different regions, whether the coastal, inland. It is informed by what the contingency plans of municipalities are telling us. And I think we're becoming we are becoming what is it? Becoming so used to risk, and so we're so immune to the loss of human life that we don't have a sense that it is okay to talk about national plans, but it is also critically important that we prevent the loss of life as we speak today. And I think as Gauteng, we want to be instrumental in ensuring that we assist local government through the Presidential Commission, but also we do some work as well in the province with the Department of Environment. So if the Commission can put us together with local government and we present templates on how these things can be done, just for preventing the loss of life. Thanks.
Thank you, Lita. What your suggestions are noted, and if there's a possibility for a response in this webinar, there will be. If not, that would be followed up by the Secretariat of the Presidential Climate Commission. But I must say that in the commission, we also have a commissioner who, I think 2 commissioners who are mayors of in the law, and they are also part of the South African Local Government Association. So, but then you'll get a response that would follow up. I would like to call on Kirsten Pearson, if you're still on the call, just to maybe ask your question, the one that you have put on the chat, or if there's another different one, you are welcome. Kirsten Pearson, are you still on the call? If not, may I call on Neo Tsotetsi? I see there are 2 hands, but I'm not sure whose hands are those. If you could help me in Tabising.
We have one hand from Tate Clement and then another one from Umamlindi.
Okay. Since Kirsten is not coming on, or maybe she doesn't like to speak, and Newo, I would call on Mamlindi to make their contributions or ask a question. Thank you, Mamlindi.
Sanibonani, ngegama ngolindi Nzwana from Oxford Adaptation. Mina ngithanda nje ukubonga i-PCC ngama-recommendations lawa sewabaliwe, and ngiyabona ukuthi most of izinto lesizisho kuma-consultations, some of the things zikhona laphaya kuma-recommendations, but however, njengoba sikhuluma nge-adaptation, sishiye i-mitigation and sikhuluma nge-NDC, and inkinga yami engiyibonayo ukuthi njengoba siyi-country sishiya okunye very important, as long nje sisabona kunama-projects afana labo MCZ lapha eVenda, angiboni mina ukuthi masikhuluma adaptation and mitigation in terms of angithi policy le NDC iyasho ukuthi sizama ukuchaza ukuthi thina South Africa sizonciphisa kanjani, but ke umbuzo wami ukuthi sinciphisa kanjani sisanawo ama-project afuna ukuthi a-emithe angayenzi izinto ezilungile noma ezincedisanayo nathi siyi-country ukuthi siphungule le-emission esikhuluma ngayo. So ngivele ngidideke nje, but nje overall ama-recommendation ngiyawabona, but i-concern yami yiyo le nje ukuthi angeke sikuthi sikhulume nge-adaptation noma sikhuluma ngama-mitigation sinama-companies afana nalawo lapha eVenda ahlukumeza abahlali in terms of i-livelihood yabo, and then as a country ku-NDC sikhuluma ngokunye. Yiyo nje i-concern yami, ngiyabonga.
Thank you, Sis Lindy. Anyone from the Secretariat who would want to interpret or translate? Or I can try. What Sis Lindy is saying is her understanding is that, firstly, she would like to thank the PCC for convening this webinar. And also she feels that what has been presented by the Chief Executive Officer actually had included views from the consultations that had taken place before. And she says what she feels has not been linked up is the issues around adaptation, the recommendation. She says they are not linked to mitigation. And she's also concerned that if really the NDCs are about us to saying how much are we going to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but then we still have carbon intensive projects on the pipeline like Musina Makaro, especially MMSEZ, which she feels that it's an irony based on what is being discussed and what would be presented at as part of the nationally determined contributions. Sister Lindy, I hope I have Nyenga Nzami summarize. Sister Lindy? Okay. Thank you. Then we'll go to the next person who raised the hand, Batuba Butlement.
Good afternoon, everyone. South Africa. Am I audible enough?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thanks, PCC, for the wonderful NDC recommendation as a thematic webinar. I thank very much. Today, as we started with adaptation, already I've read the whole adaptation. It's a very long issue that we have to put hands on, because already our adaptation, like Mam Lindy have said before, they are not just for all the communities, because we present the grassroots communities, like as the project in Makado. We must mitigate, we must adapt, but we are still cutting the trees. We are still opening up for global warming, which means we are doing the vice versa of these NDCs. And also, I would like to comment on the IRP. Our NDC have not reflected on all the fossil fuels that we will be using moving forward to 2035. We have to abolish all the fossil fuels, because the NDC and the Paris Agreement says we must promote the renewable energy. Then we promoting the profits where the people are doing the projects on the land where the poor and the vulnerable people are affected by this climate change. Also, I would like us to follow the concept of the successful adaptation, because they need the effectiveness, they need the efficiency, they need equity and legitimacy, because these days it depends who take out the decision like the DFFE. We need each and every PCC meeting, the DFFE members must be there because the PCC is doing DFFE job by giving them presentations, by giving them research, but there's no one from the DFFE come and collaborate with all of us as stakeholders. Lastly, I would like all of us to consider the Climate Change Act, because even on these recommendations, they've alluded and noted that we need the Climate Change Act to be operationalized. And also the PCC must be, with the immediate effect, do their job so that the emitters and the polluters must be prosecuted, because now we are talking about mitigating from the greenhouse gases, but the polluters are still not being prosecuted, and also the grassroots communities are affected. We need the release of the loss and damage fund, and also the climate change response fund must be released to the people who need it. Even now, yesterday and day before, we did have the floods in Eastern Cape. We have to support those people. You can see even in the news, we don't have to do the talk. We have to do the action now. The climate action is needed now. Thanks.
Relebohang Tate Clement, if there's another chance to speak, you will be. I was about to intervene there. And thanks for bringing up the points that I have brought up. I'll call on Neo, and after Neo, I'll ask the panel maybe to comment on the questions or the contributions that other people, that members of the audience have made, or also maybe respond to the questions on the Q&A or the statements that have been made on the Q&A. So Neo, after you, I'll call on the panel to engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Am I audible?
Yes, you are very audible.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. My question was more on, thank you so much for the recommendations report firstly. And my question was more on just recommendations for health. I felt like they were a bit limited compared to the other sectors, such as agriculture and the built environment. And I just wanted to sort of understand how the PCC has engaged or consulted with the health sector. Yeah, and if there have been any challenges around engaging the National Department of Health, for example. I'm not sure if everyone is aware, but currently the National Department of Health is updating the climate change and health adaptation strategy. And I think it will be quite important for some of the recommendations that the PCC is making to link with that strategy as well. So I think, yeah, that was sort of my question, to better understand how health is represented within these discussions and consultations with the different sectors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Neo, for that. I will hand over now to the panel to respond either to the questions on the Q&A and also from what people have raised. You don't have to answer all the questions. Maybe you can pick one or two and let the others also respond to other questions. Thank you. In no particular order, between Sister Ora, Buitumelo, Brandon, and Kgaugelo. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I was hoping to respond last so that I can also go into the way forward discussion.
Yes, and maybe let's do it that way. I will ask the reps from civil society, from labor, and the youth, including Commissioner Janse. If they want to respond to any questions or concerns, please do so now. I don't know if you want me to call you out or you just automatically just speak when the other person has just spoken. Thank you. Brandon, I see you ready.
Thanks, Makoma. Yeah, just to maybe speak to comments made by Clement and Lindy. And some of this goes a little bit beyond just adaptation, but we also know that the better we mitigate, the less we have to adapt. So just reference to the IRP, I know the draft recommendation speaks about more analysis being needed around the inclusion of gas, for example, in the IRP, as well as the delayed decommissioning of coal. I would say the NDC needs to be a bit stronger than simply talking about an analysis. I think it needs to highlight the risk of getting locked into high carbon development, because that's just going to push the adaptation and then the loss and damage bills even higher. And I'm glad the Messina Mercado Special Economic Zone was mentioned. This is basically a carbon bomb that could use up to 16% of South Africa's carbon budget. And being involved in legal action around that, we can just say that the climate change impact assessment really didn't look at adaptation adequately at all. There are going to be tremendous impacts in that area. Also, climate change impacts on the project itself, and an impact on local communities' ability to be climate resilient. So again, the NDC is not about naming specific projects or even specific interventions, but we would like to see some kind of strong statements in there that we really need to stop moving in the wrong direction, and that climate impact assessments around adaptation need to be vastly strengthened. Thank you.
Thank you. Bitumelo, thank you.
Sure, thank you, Commissioner. I think the colleagues, especially Ndate Clement and Mam Lindy, raise quite critical issues of social dialogue and inclusivity, which is the core principles of what organized labor strongly believes should be key and should be focused on in ensuring that we are responding adequately with the people that we want to assist in adapting to climate adversities in mind, and them leading the discussion. So those comments are very much appreciated. And I think that the Clement also raises the importance of having DFFE as part of the process and not only as respondents of the proposals and recommendations that the PCC does. So it's very important to have a broader collaboration with government. And I think it's one of the points that are raised, in that there needs to be some sort of synergies in relation to what DFFE does, the Department of Electricity and Energy, the Department of Mineral Resources as well. So I think there needs to be those synergies so that we know how to then locate our discussion. The issue of making reference to the IRP is very important and quite essential. And I think it's something that we need to start to investigate and incorporate more, because the IRP discussions are taking place at the level of NEDLAC. And those discussions need to be cognizant of subsequent processes, including the one of submitting an NDC towards the UNFCCC COP process later this year. I think just to emphasize the importance of those key sectors and ensuring that we are having plans that are sector specific is very important. And also ensuring that the interventions that are done, especially from our side, are able to be across the sector. I think it was Neo that raised quite specifically how it is that the health sector is going to be considered in this. And I think it's going to be important for the PCC to delve deeper into what the sector-specific recommendations would be, and how it is that we can incorporate that. While we understand that the NDC is going to be a very succinct and compact document, it's going to be important for us to be able to further elaborate on the recommendations that we're speaking to. And I think just also to note that, I mean, adaptation is very urgent, and the urgency of actually having climate adaptive processes, policies, and considerations are going to be very important. So yeah, we should basically see adaptation as a social and economic investment where we are saving lives, we're localizing our efforts, and we're able to respond adequately and efficiently to the needs that we have through that NDC, but also being able to have the NDC reflective of our day-to-day experiences as South Africans. Thanks, Comrade Chair.
Thank you, Bitumelo. Hello.
Thank you so much for that engaging discussion, but also the very critical questions that are coming in from the audience. I would just say that, to emphasize that adaptation in not just the NDC, but in general, national strategies needs to be more than just a policy goal that is seated at the national level. It has to be a practical pathway for resilience for this country, but also it has to lead to us resolving other key issues that we face, and it has to be linked and it has to be holistic in how we look at adaptation, not just adaptation as a thematic area that is separate from other development priorities that we have as a country, but it has to be very integral to our development. And I think seeing the way in which this discussion went, I am quite optimistic that we have an opportunity to transform how we respond to climate risks and unlock adaptation as more than just a problem that we have in this country, but an opportunity that could lead to climate resilience. And just to reiterate what some of the other speakers were saying, the sector-specific targets are really important, but they should also just go beyond targets. They should allow for accountability, resource alignment, and actually placing resources in these sectors. So we have to engage the relevant departments, as mentioned, but also ensure that we're engaging in a way that can enable measurable outcomes. So we really have to be intentional about that, even for those of us who are standing on the sidelines of policy. We have to really step in and overstep where needed and identify where the help needs to be. And I want to commend PCC for taking this very inclusive approach to this process. And I think, as we've said, adaptation will require different investments from society, partnerships from different parts of society, and we need those, especially in mobilizing resources and financial means to actually implement the NDC. That is very important. But also the other point that was raised is the point of health, and I think that's a very key one. We've seen how COVID-19 was, and I think we have to be intentional about how we integrate health, not just in adaptation, but in how we understand climate change as a country. And I think moving forward, our approach to adaptation needs to be sector specific, but also very much sensitive to the impact at areas that affect climate change. So from health to transport, to infrastructure, for example, it has to be in that kind of mindset, so that we enable the right tools that are necessary from the different sectors that are affected. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hello, and the other panelists. I just want to say that the discussions continues. If people have got questions, I know there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of issues that have been raised, but for follow-up, if you feel that that has not yet, or that has not covered in this webinar, you can still continue interacting with the Presidential Climate Commission, and you may email to mitigation@climatecommission.org.za, or go on to the PCC website. I think there's that application. If if I'm not mistaken, where you can also write, or there's a general email address where you can pose a question. And I know the Secretariat from the PCC is very interactive and engaging, and you might be able to get responses, or they refer you to the other institutions where you could be able to get clarity or responses to the questions that you may have. But what the Presidential Climate Change Commission does is to convene these dialogues, can be able to discuss these issues. We can be able to bring in views, we can develop positions, and we can develop what needs to be done. For example, what came out today was the question of implementation, and the means of implementation are part of the recommendations that the PCC is making on the NDCs that are to be submitted at the end of this year or later this year. I'm going to request Sister Ora to do the closing remarks and the way forward. And the reason I'm giving her enough time is for her to also be able to respond in case to some of the concerns, the questions that has been raised, but also just to caution everyone that we don't have all the answers. And that is why we convene these consultations, we convene these webinars, so that we can know what is important and we can be able to respond or develop our responses to that. Thank you very much. I see Tabiseng has put in the PCC website on the chat, but also she's also announcing a thematic webinar on the NDC's focus on mitigation. So I would really encourage, particularly those who raised issues around adaptation, not linking to mitigation, to be part of, but this is an open one, and it's quite an important thematic webinar, same as the one that we're having now. So, Sister Ora, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I note that Meneo and Mr. Clement's hands are still up. I'm not sure whether they have pressing issues, or should we proceed? Okay, I think it was probably
maybe
legacy hands.
Were those legacy hands or were those new hands?
I think Mr. Clement's one remains up.
I think he's using a phone and may not be able to know what to do. Let me suggest that we continue.
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much, and I'm glad you've ended on the issue of the mitigation section of the NDC, which I would really request participants to join. That is the one section that always attracts rigorous debates, because there's probably divergent views on how ambitious we can be as a country in terms of our mitigation commitments. So for us, it will help a lot. It will help us a lot if we listen to as many people as possible. We tried, myself and colleagues, to respond to most of the questions that are on a chat, which on the Q&A chat, which is quite a lot of them, and we really appreciate. And just for you to note that even though we haven't responded to everything, for me, most questions serve as a lens through which we are able to go back and reflect and look at issues we might not have looked at. So do rest assured that each and every point that's been put there will be considered by the team that's working on the drafting. So we've captured all of them. Without really going into detail, I will just comment on one or two issues. And there was one issue that was raised around financing, and what is the current financing situation, and shouldn't that become an entry point of where we start? So what we know is that finance hasn't flowed as well as we had wanted it to, especially in the adaptation space. What we've also established is that the money is there. The challenge is not the how much, even though, yes, the continued fight is there to try and get more funds into the system. But the main issue is not how much, but it's how and who accesses the funds that are available. So the how and the who is the key issue that we need to solve for and focus on, which is why you would have seen, and it comes out very strongly in the means of implementation section of the NDCs, which I believe there's also going to be a webinar on that. And Thabiseng will share the dates for that one as well. We are pushing very strongly as the PCC currently for establishment of country platforms to finance climate action, taking a lot of lessons from the platform that we already have, which is the Just Energy Transitions investment plan. That is, I mean, parts of it are very successful and parts of it there are challenges, and we are learning from those challenges as we build up our adaptation and resilience parts. And for us, it's just about, nationally led and driven financial flows that will leverage on multiple sources of funds. Yes, international being one, and I think I've mentioned it in the presentation. There was also a question around that. What about private sector? So we are looking very closely on private sector, not just companies, but then your private financial sector, especially where adaptation and resilience is involved. There's the insurance sector. And it's actually quite encouraging to see that most of the large insurance companies are starting to look into the space, because it's better to prevent and work with us on adaptation and resilience rather than the costs they incur following in damaged by any major event that would be happening. So that space we are looking at. My colleague from COGTA raised the issue around integration with the district delivery model. That conversation needs to continue. So we do work with and engage with SALGA quite a lot. COGTA is also invited to really come to the table, but I'm quite sure, 100% sure that COGTA is also engaging with the DFFE to just make sure that that integration with the district delivery model is there, especially when we get to the parts of implementation plans and how we make sure that we rejig our disaster response plans and approaches. There were issues around being radical. Commissioner Janse, yes, you. So we try not to say it in so many words. We will leave you to articulate. But the part that we've mentioned on South-South financial flows, most of it responds directly to the shifting global geopolitical situations where we now know that we cannot entirely be relying on the global north. And I'm not singling out any particular country, but at this point in time, we know the challenges that we are facing. Yes, those relations with the global north remains very important, and we need to make sure that those funds flow as they're supposed to, and we plan for them sufficiently. But at the same time, even within the African region itself, intra-Africa collaboration becomes very critical, and which is why now the discussions with development banks, starting with the African development banks all the way through to DBSA, remains a key issue, and that work is underway. What's really encouraging is that all these institutions now, we are all speaking the same language. So we are no longer in that situation where we are trying to understand each other. We all understand each other. The main issue is for us to crack the actual implementation. David, thank you very much for raising the climate refugees issue. I personally feel that that is an area we really still need to explore very seriously and draw in the relevant government departments, including the Department of Home Affairs, just on how we deal with not just climate refugees as in coming from neighboring countries, but also in-country movements from certain centers to other centers that might displace people, but also somehow compromise local economies. So thank you for raising that. We will see with the team how that gets considered in the current iteration. If then that's not possible, I'm just then also flagging it as a critical area for us also as a commission to engage on. We've noted an important area of translation. My colleague Blessing is in the meeting, and I'm sure when he saw that comment to say, translate in all languages so that everybody understands, he probably jumped up and wanted to say to us, I told you so. So those are the discussions we are having internally as the PCC in terms of how we ensure that this information is properly digested at the correct level and understood by everyone. And he's really spearheading that work for us, so that we would do. Let me also, the others, I think we've responded on the chart, the health and social protection, which is included. Maybe let me talk as the last issue before I go into way forward on the role of National Treasury. So National Treasury has been doing really amazing work on, I mentioned the climate tagging. At the moment, they are also working on the review of the climate tax and working very closely with DFFE to make sure that it's aligned to the sector emissions targets. So they're doing quite well there. But then over and above that, through their chairpersonship of the Sustainable Finance Working Group in the G20, what I've seen National Treasury is doing is to really push for sustainable climate finance, especially through the lens of adaptation and resilience, to find prominence in the G20 processes. So I think we can rest assured that National Treasury is doing their bit. We are working very closely with them as the PCC, just on crafting and correcting the fiscal frameworks that are meant to support climate action broadly. So with all that said, Chair, so currently we are doing this series of webinars on the draft NDC document that we've released to get, so to say, final round of stakeholder comments that would see us refine the PCC recommendations document, which will then go into the DFFE finalization process. We do know that the DFFE has got the draft NDC is almost in place, ready to go into the cabinet process. So in the government decision-making processes, what would happen is that the draft gets put in place. Before it goes out for public comment, it needs cabinet approval. And I do believe that in the next week or two, the DFFE will be getting cabinet approval for circulation of the draft, so that comments are received. Then everyone will get an opportunity to formally table the comments. We are also continually submitting our views and our drafts and all of that. So once that draft is out, we will then, as the PCC, with the final recommendations reports, together with the draft from DFFE in the early parts of July, first or second week of July, be convening the colloquium that will be publishing our recommendations report, which then DFFE will finalize and target to submit around September, October, well before COP30. So those are the timelines we are working on. With regards to this process, like, we are encouraging you to still participate in the other two webinars that focuses on the two other complementary chapters of this recommendations document. Following that, it will be a colloquium. You'll give comments still through those processes, but we also still encourage you to also individually or as different groups to also give your comments through the formal draft that will be gazetted following by the DFFE following cabinet approval. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dora Modise, the CEO of, or the Executive Director of the Presidential Climate Change Commission. And I would also like to thank our panelists from Lebogang Molaisi, Brandon Abdino, Boitumelo Molete, and Kgaugelo. Thank you very much for making today's discussion and putting on to the views from your respective sectors, but also thank the participants for their input. You're still open to make more inputs. You can email, you can also go to the website of the Presidential Climate Commission to make more of your inputs. And I just hope that you also have noted that there's still a window open of making comments or submissions to the National Determined Contributions sometime in July, but I would really encourage people to do so now, so that whatever views they have or submissions that they want to make, or the gaps that they find in the current recommendations or the current PCC recommendations, that they can input, so that that can be included in the final recommendations that are going to be shared. Thank you to the Secretariat who had put this webinar together. If it was not of you, would not be able to, if you would not be facilitating these platforms, would not be able to have dialogues and also share our views and contributions to the national discourse around climate change, and also around different issues that would really want to put together, or also have views upon or develop, so that we can have a better life for all. Thank you very much, and much appreciated your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair.